The words still echoed in the conquered hall when Princess Velara of House Solin realized the human had not flinched. She had spoken them clearly, pitched for the gallery of diplomats lining the tiered seats above, and every syllable had landed exactly as intended. "You are beneath me, human." 5 words, delivered with the calm authority of a woman who had commanded warships before her 20th cycle. The Caliph delegation had murmured approval. The Dreven envoys had looked away, embarrassed for the man standing alone on the obsidian floor below her dais. Ambassador Torlin of the Unified Reach had pressed his thin lips together and said nothing. But the human commander Declan Hale, military attaché to Earth's provisional diplomatic mission, had simply held her gaze. Not with defiance, not with the wounded anger she had expected and, if she was honest, wanted. He had looked at her the way one might look at a storm that had not yet decided whether to break. Then he had inclined his head 1 degree and said, "Understood, Your Grace." That had been 3 years ago. Now Velara stood at the same obsidian rail, looking down at the same hall, and the memory pressed against her sternum like a blade she had swallowed and never quite digested. Below, the conquered chambers were being dressed for the Accord renewal banners of silver and deep indigo draped across the vaulted ceiling, the air thick with the scent of torchvine blossoms the servants had threaded through the balustrades. In 6 hours, every delegate in the sector would take their seats. In 6 hours, Declan Hale would walk through those doors again. She turned from the rail, and her reflection caught in the polished black stone teal skin, the color of deep ocean at dusk, auburn copper hair pulled back in the severe military braid of her house, amber eyes that burned like signal fires when she was angry and smoldered like dying coals when she was not. The ceremonial collar of woven starstone pressed cool against her collarbones. She did not look like a woman who had spent 3 years learning the precise dimensions of her own arrogance. But she had, fracture by fracture, lesson by quiet lesson, each one delivered not by lecture or rebuke but by the simple, unbearable example of a man who did not know how to be less than decent. The first fracture came 41 days after the insult. The Lyren station's water reclamation system had failed in the lower residential ring, the quarters assigned to non-allied delegations, the overflow housing, the servants and translators, and the small Earth mission that everyone agreed did not warrant better. 3 Caliph engineers had assessed the damage and declared it a 6-week repair. The Dreven contingent had offered sympathy and nothing else. Velara's own house Solin Maintenance Corps had been ordered to prioritize the upper rings, where the delegates who mattered kept their suites. She had not thought about it, not once. The lower rings residents drank recycled gray water and rationed what was left, and Velara filed the report and moved on to trade disputes that carried real political weight. Then her aide, Councillor Meyerth, had mentioned over evening reports that the human attaché had been seen in the lower ring service tunnels. Every day, 12 hours at a stretch. Meyerth had said it with the bemused contempt their court reserved for species that did not know their place. "He's down there with pipe sealant on his uniform, Your Grace, crawling through conduits meant for maintenance drones. It's almost sad." Velara had said nothing, but that night she lay in her quarters and stared at the ceiling and could not identify why the word sad sat wrong in her chest. She told herself it was the inefficiency that bothered her. A military attaché had no business doing mechanical work. It was a misallocation of resources, a failure of proper delegation, the kind of thing that happened when a species had no understanding of hierarchy. She told herself this for 11 days while the human kept crawling through tunnels, and on the 12th day she went down to the lower ring to see for herself. She had expected to find something pathetic. A man out of his depth, fumbling with alien technology, making a show of effort that would ultimately require Caliph engineers to correct. What she found instead dismantled a small, load-bearing wall inside her. Hale was not alone. He had organized the lower ring's residents' Theshan translators, Corvin service staff, two Solène servants who had no business taking orders from anyone outside house authority into a working crew. The translators relayed his technical instructions across 4 languages. The Corvin, whose species had 6-fingered hands ideal for fine mechanical work, handled the delicate valve assemblies. The Solène servants ran supply chains from the upper ring's surplus stores, and Velara noticed with a start that they were using House Solène requisition codes that no human should have had access to. She should have been furious. Someone had given him those codes. Someone in her own house had decided that this human's unauthorized repair effort mattered more than protocol. Instead, she watched from the corridor junction as Hale emerged from a conduit hatch, pipe sealant streaked across his jaw and temple, his Earth-issue uniform stained dark with coolant. He was speaking to a Thessian translator, a young female named Lysine, barely past her maturation cycle, clearly frightened of the malfunction and what it meant for the lower ring's children. 3 more days, he told her. His voice was not loud. It was not reassuring in the way politicians were reassuring, all polish and empty confidence. It was the voice of a man who had counted the remaining pipe joints and divided them by the hours he had left. We'll have pressure restored to the east quadrant by tomorrow. The west will take longer. Keep the secondary cistern sealed until I check the filtration membrane. Lysine nodded, and Velara saw something in the young woman's face that she recognized but could not name. It was the expression of someone who had been told the truth by a person who intended to make it hold. One of the Corvin workers spotted Velara in the junction. His hands froze on the valve he was threading. Hale followed the worker's gaze and his eyes found hers, and for one held second, something passed between them that Velara would spend weeks refusing to examine. Not hostility, not deference, something closer to a question, asked and answered in the same glance. She left without speaking. She did not announce herself. She did not offer House Solène's engineering corps. She walked back to the upper ring and sat in her private study and looked at her hands and thought, for the first time in her adult life, that she had misjudged something fundamental. She had called him beneath her. He had gone beneath the station and fixed what she had not bothered to notice was broken. The water was restored in 4 days, not 6 weeks. Meyerth reported it with the same bemused tone, and this time the word sad did not appear, and Velara noticed its absence. She also noticed that 3 of her own Solène servants had begun nodding to the human attaché when they passed him in the corridors, a small thing, barely visible, but Velara's people did not nod to outsiders. Not unless they had been given a reason. The memory dissolved as Meyerth entered the observation gallery in the present, datapad in hand, her gray-green features arranged in the expression of professional neutrality that meant bad news. Your Grace, the Caliph delegation has formally requested that Commander Hale be excluded from the Accord renewal ceremony. Velara's fingers tightened on the rail. On what grounds? Species Compatibility Protocol, Section 14 of the Lyren Charter. They're invoking the clause that restricts unaligned species from participating in binding diplomatic functions. Meyerth paused. It's technically valid. Earth hasn't been granted aligned status. Earth's provisional mission has attended every renewal for 3 cycles. As observers, the Caliph are arguing that Commander Hale's recent visibility has exceeded observer parameters. Meyerth's pause carried the weight of everything she was not saying. He brokered the Tessin shipping corridor resolution last month. He mediated the Corvin labor dispute. He reorganized the station's emergency medical distribution after the docking bay fire. He sat with the Dreven widow admiral for 9 hours after her son's ship was lost. The Caliph are not comfortable with a human carrying that much quiet influence. They're not comfortable because he earned it instead of inheriting it. Meyerth looked at her sharply. Velara heard the words leaving her mouth and realized, with a sensation like stepping off a ledge, that she meant them. Reject the request, she said. Your Grace, Rejecting a formal Caliph petition requires a counterfiling under House authority. You would be publicly aligning House Solin with Earth's mission. The political cost. I said rejected. The words came out harder than she intended, and she saw Myrth's ears flatten in the Solin gesture of surprised deference. Velara forced her voice level. File the counter-petition. Use my personal seal, not the House seal. If there is a political cost, it falls on me. Myrth studied her for a long moment. Then, quietly, you've changed your position on the human. It was not a question, and Velara did not treat it as one. File the petition, Myrth. After her counselor left, Velara pressed her forehead against the cool obsidian rail and closed her eyes, and the second fracture surfaced like a body rising from deep water. 8 months after the water reclamation, a state dinner, 40 delegates around a curved table of Lyren crystal, Velara seated at the head as House Solin's ranking representative, Hale seated at the far end, below the Corvin trade envoys, in the position reserved for observers and staff who had been invited as a courtesy. She had not planned to watch him, but the Caliph ambassador, Lord Rithan, had chosen that evening to make a point about humanity's place in the sector. He had done it elegantly. The Caliph always did, by proposing a toast to the species who have earned their seats at this table, and letting the silence after the toast do the work of exclusion. 40 delegates had raised their glasses. Hale had not been offered one. Velara had watched the human sit with his hands folded on the table, his expression composed, his eyes steady on the middle distance. He did not look down. He did not look angry. He did not squirm or flush or make any of the small, betraying movements that a lesser man would have made. He simply existed in the space they had tried to erase him from, and his refusal to shrink was louder than any speech Lord Rithan could have written. She had felt something shift in her chest, the same tectonic creak she had felt in the lower rings corridor, but this time it came with a secondary emotion she was even less prepared for, shame, because she remembered her own words, "You are beneath me, human," and realized they had been cut from the same cloth as Rithan's toast. She had done the same thing. She had tried to make him smaller, and he had simply stayed the size he was. Midway through the meal, a Corvin serving attendant had stumbled near Hale's end of the table, dropping a tray of crystal stemware that shattered across the floor. The Caliph had looked away in distaste. 2 delegates near the spill had pushed back their chairs. The Corvin attendant, young, trembling, ears pressed flat in mortification, had frozen in place, waiting to be dismissed. Hale stood, not quickly, not dramatically. He rose from his chair and knelt on the floor beside the attendant and began picking up broken crystal with his bare hands. A shard cut his palm. Velara saw the blood red, impossibly red against the pale crystal, and watched him continue picking up pieces without acknowledging the wound. The Corvin attendant stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then her trembling stopped, and she knelt beside him and helped, and together they cleared the glass while 40 delegates pretended to be absorbed in conversation. No one else at the table moved. Velara's hands gripped her wine glass so hard she thought the stem would crack. She wanted to stand. She wanted to walk to the other end of the table and kneel beside the human and the Corvin girl and help them gather broken crystal. The wanting was so fierce it frightened her, but she did not stand. She sat at the head of the table and held her silence and her rank, and the shame burned deeper than any insult she had ever received, because this time she was the one who deserved it. After the dinner, she had found herself walking the long corridor toward the observation deck. She found him there, standing at the viewport, looking out at the nebula that wrapped Lyren's station in violet and gold. A thin bandage circled his right palm where the crystal had cut him. He had heard her approach and turned. "Your Grace," the same measured tone, the same single degree of inclination, no warmth, no coldness, just a man who had filed her under senior officer of a species that does not want me here and behaved accordingly. She had stood beside him for a full minute before speaking. The toast was poorly done. "It was well done, actually," he said, and she had looked at him sharply, ready to hear bitterness. But his mouth had the faintest curve, not a smile, something quieter, something like a man who had seen the maneuver and respected its craftsmanship while refusing its premise. Rathan's been working on the aligned species language for months. The toast was the opening move. The real play is the charter amendment he'll propose next session. Velara had stared at him. "You know about the amendment?" "I know about most things that happen on this station, Your Grace. I just can't do anything about most of them." He paused. "Not yet." There was no arrogance in it, no threat, just a cartographer's calm acknowledgement of the terrain ahead. He knew where the ground was solid and where it would give way, and he was walking carefully, and he was not going to stop. She had wanted to tell him about the Corvin girl, about how he had knelt on a floor that no one at that table would have touched, about how the blood on his palm had looked like a cost paid for something no one had asked him to buy. She had wanted to say, "I am beginning to understand that everything I was taught about hierarchy may have been wrong." But the word stuck behind her teeth, held there by 3 decades of training that said a Solène princess did not bend toward anyone, least of all a human with pipe sealant under his nails and a bandaged hand. "Good night, Commander," she said. She left. She hated herself for leaving. She lay in her quarters and stared at the ceiling and admitted, to no one in the dark, that she was afraid. Not of him, of what she would become if she let herself see him clearly. Because seeing Declan Hale clearly meant dismantling every assumption she had built her identity on, and she did not know who she would be on the other side of that demolition. 2 months later, a third incident deepened the crack. A docking bay malfunction caused a pressure seal failure in Section 9, and 3 Theshan translators were trapped behind a bulkhead that had fused shut. Station Emergency Services dispatched a team that estimated 90 minutes to cut through. Velara heard about it through standard channels and noted it in her daily brief. Hale cut through in 32 minutes, not with superior technology, not with some human trick. He had studied the station's original Corvin engineering schematics documents that most diplomats did not even know existed, and found an auxiliary maintenance shaft that ran parallel to the fused bulkhead. He crawled through it, pried open a secondary access panel with a tool he had modified from cafeteria utensils, and reached the translators before the emergency team had finished setting up their cutting array. One of the translators was Lysine. Her daughter had been sick that week, and Lysine had been working overtime to cover for a colleague who had resigned after the water crisis. When Hale pulled her through the access panel, she gripped his arm with both hands, and the sound she made was not gratitude, it was relief so profound it came out as a single, wordless exhalation that carried the weight of everything she had been too tired and too scared to say. Velara watched the security footage of this, too. She was developing a habit. She told herself it was operational oversight. She told herself it was political intelligence gathering. She told herself anything except the truth, which was that watching Declan Hale move through the station's crises was the closest she had come in years to understanding what leadership was actually supposed to look like. After the Section 9 rescue, Meyerth had brought Velara her evening briefing and paused mid-report. "The Theshan delegation has sent a formal note of appreciation to the human attaché, addressed to Commander Hale, with a copy to your office." "Why to my office?" "Because 2 of the trapped translators were assigned to house Solène's cultural exchange program. They are technically under your jurisdiction. The Theshans are acknowledging that Hale did what your house's emergency protocols failed to do." Meyerth's voice carried no judgment, but the words did their own work. Velara had read the note 3 times. It was brief. Theshans valued economy in all things, and it contained a single phrase that lodged itself in her ribs. He came when no one with authority would. She had wanted to respond, to draft some official acknowledgement, some retroactive recognition of what the human had done, But every version she composed sounded like what it was: a powerful person trying to take credit for a decency that had never occurred to her. She deleted them all. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She went to the lower ring's maintenance office, a converted storage bay that Hale had turned into a coordination hub, and stood in the doorway and watched him work. He was reviewing supply manifests with a Corvin logistics specialist, cross-referencing filtration component inventories against projected failure rates. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. There was a mug of something on his desk that one of the Theshan translators had brought him, a local infusion, pale green, that Velara knew was typically reserved for close family. He drank it without ceremony, the way a man drinks what he has been given by people who trust him. He saw her in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The Corvin specialist quietly excused himself. "Can I help you, Your Grace?" The same measured tone. But she thought she heard something else in it now, not warmth, exactly, but an awareness. The awareness of a man who has noticed he is being watched and is choosing not to remark on it. "I came to see the maintenance logs for the Section 9 bulkhead repair," she said, which was a lie. "I can send them to your office." "I would rather see them here." He studied her for a beat. Then he pulled a second chair to his desk, a battered thing salvaged from the upper ring's surplus, its cushion patched with what looked like remnant fabric from a Corvin ceremonial sash. She sat in it, and for 40 minutes she reviewed maintenance logs she did not need to see, and he answered her questions with the same patience he gave the translators and the Corvin workers and the Dreven families. And she learned that his hands were steady when he pointed to schematics, and that his voice dropped half a register when he was explaining something he cared about, and that the green infusion smelled like mountain air after rain. She left without thanking him. She did not know how to thank him without admitting what the visit meant, and she was not ready for that. But she came back, twice more that month, then once a week, then without either of them naming it, the visits became a fixture. She told Meyerth she was conducting oversight inspections. Meyerth said nothing, but her ears tilted at the angle that meant she had opinions she was professionally obligated to keep. 9 months before the Accord renewal, there was a cargo dispute between two minor delegations that threatened to escalate into a formal grievance before the Lyran arbitration panel. Velara's staff drafted a resolution that followed precedent. Hale, during one of her inspection visits, pointed out a clause in the station's founding charter that offered a simpler path, one that the minor delegations could accept without either side losing face. She used his suggestion. It worked. The dispute resolved in 2 days instead of the projected 3 weeks. She did not credit him publicly. She did not need to. The minor delegations knew where the solution had come from. The lower ring's communication network was faster and more reliable than the official diplomatic channels, and their quiet respect for the human attaché deepened by another degree. It was during this period that Velara began to understand something about Declan Hale that frightened her more than anything else. He was not building power. He was not accumulating influence. He was not playing a long game or positioning himself for a political victory. He was simply solving problems, one at a time, for people who needed them solved, and the influence was a byproduct that he neither sought nor particularly wanted. The station's residents trusted him not because he was clever or strategic, but because he showed up, and he did the work, and he told the truth about how long it would take. That was it. That was the whole of him, and it was more than anyone else on the station could claim, including her. The final visit before the Accord renewal had been 2 days ago. She had come to the maintenance office as usual, under the pretense of reviewing supply chain reports. Hale had been alone, which was rare. The Corvin logistics specialist had left early for a family ceremony, and Lysine's daughter was performing in some kind of Theshan school recital that the translator had been nervous about for weeks. Velara had sat in the battered chair and read reports she had already memorized, and Hale had worked at his terminal, and for 20 minutes neither of them had spoken. The silence between them had changed over the months. It had started as something brittle, the silence of two people who did not know how to address the distance between them, and slowly transformed into something almost companionable. Almost. There was still a wall, and they both knew it, and they both knew who had built it. Then Hale had said, without looking up from his terminal, "The green infusion. Lysine told me it's called Valeth. It's only given to people you consider part of your household." Valara had looked at the mug on his desk. "I know what Valeth means, Commander." "I wanted to make sure you did." He had looked up then, and his gray eyes held something she had never seen in them before, not the careful neutrality of a man managing expectations, but something rawer, something that looked like a man deciding whether to say a thing he had been holding for a very long time. "Lysine's daughter made me a drawing last week," he said. "It's pinned to the wall behind my terminal. She drew me as an alien, gave me pointed ears and blue skin, and put me in Theshan formal clothes. When Lysine saw it, she cried." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. The people in the lower ring don't see me as Earth's representative. They don't see me as a political asset. They see me as someone who lives here, who belongs here. And I have spent 3 years wondering whether anyone above the lower ring would ever see me the same way." His eyes had held hers, and the question in them was not a question about diplomacy or politics or aligned status. It was a question about her, about whether the princess who had dismissed him on his first day could become the woman who chose him. She had opened her mouth. She had closed it. She had stood up and walked out of the maintenance office without answering, and the shame of that departure was worse than anything that had come before, because this time he had asked, and she had failed. 2 days. She had carried his question for 2 days. And now the Accord renewal was here, and the Caliph were trying to erase him again, and Valara was done failing. Now, 3 years after the insult, with the Accord renewal 5 hours away, and her counter-petition filed against the Caliph, Valara dressed for the ceremony. The formal regalia of House Solin, deep indigo silk over structured silver armor plate, the ceremonial collar pressing its cool weight against her throat. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a princess who had spent most of her life believing that rank was the same thing as worth. Declan Hale had never once spoken of rank. Not his, not hers, not anyone's. He spoke of water pressure and shipping corridors, and the names of translators, children, and how many hours a repair would take. He spoke of things that were real, and he made them hold, and every time he did it, the distance between them shrank by one more unit of measure that Valara did not have a word for. The third fracture, the one that had broken the wall, entirely surfaced, as she fastened the thin circlet of office across her brow. 14 months ago, the Tessen crisis. A border skirmish between the Tessen Collective and the Dreven Empire had escalated to the point where Lyren Station's neutrality was threatened. The Caliph had withdrawn to their quarters. 3 minor delegations had sealed their sections. House Solin's military advisors had recommended the same, and Valara had been drafting the withdrawal order, the sensible order, the order that protected her people, and cost her nothing except 17 Dreven lives that were not her responsibility, when Myrth appeared with a report that stopped her hand. "Commander Hale has gone to the Tessen quarter, alone." "He's done what?" "The Tessen are holding 17 Dreven civilians, families, children." Hale walked into the Tessen quarter unarmed and asked to speak with their commander. Valara's blood had gone cold. The Tessen were not the Caliph. They did not play elegant games of exclusion. They were a warrior species, proud and volatile, and their commander, Warlord Tessic, had killed his own lieutenant 3 days prior for questioning an order. A human walking into that quarter alone was not bravery. It was mathematics that did not balance. She had gone to the security monitoring station and pulled the feeds. The footage was grainy. The Tessen quarter's surveillance was deliberately degraded to honor their privacy agreements, but she could see him. Hale, standing in the corridor outside the holding area where the Dreven families were being kept, facing Tessic and 4 armed guards. He was not pleading. He was not negotiating in the way she understood negotiation, the careful exchange of concessions, the leveraging of power against power. He was speaking quietly, and she could not hear the words through the degraded audio, but she could see Tessic's face. The warlord's jaw was set, his posture rigid, his hands near his weapon. One word wrong and the human would die in that corridor, and no one would file a complaint. Then something Hale said reached the warlord, and Velara watched the rigid posture shift. Not soften, the Tessin did not soften, but the locked joint unlocked. The hand moved away from the weapon. 12 minutes in, Tessic dismissed 2 of his guards. 15 minutes in, the warlord's shoulders dropped a half-inch, imperceptible to anyone who had not studied Tessin body language, but Velara had, and she knew what it meant. Concession. Not surrender, but the acknowledgement that the man in front of him had said something that could not be answered with force. 18 minutes in, the warlord sat down on a corridor bench, which in Tessin culture was an act reserved for equals. 23 minutes in, Tessic opened the holding area doors. The Dreven families walked out, 2 mothers carrying infants, an elderly male leaning on a younger woman, children. 6 of them, the youngest no older than 4 cycles, wide-eyed and silent in the way children get when they have learned that noise brings danger. One child, a girl with dark hair and a scraped elbow, took Hale's hand during the walk to the neutral zone. He let her. His face on the security feed was tired and dirty, and composed in a way that made Velara's eyes burn. She watched the footage 3 times. The 3rd time, she noticed something she had missed before. When the Dreven girl had taken Hale's hand, his fingers had closed around hers with the careful, practiced gentleness of a man who understood that the child's grip was not about navigation, but about trust. He had adjusted his pace to match hers. He had positioned himself between the child and the corridor wall, shielding her from the direction where Tessic's remaining guards still stood. He had done these things automatically, without thought, the way a man does things that are built into his foundation rather than learned from a manual. Velara had seen commanders move through hostile territory. She had seen soldiers escort civilians. She had never seen anyone do it the way Hale did, as if the child's safety was not a tactical consideration, but a personal covenant. She deleted her withdrawal order. She called Meyerth. Send House Solen's medical corps to the neutral zone, full triage team, food, blankets, trauma counselors for the children. Meyerth hesitated. Your Grace, deploying House resources to assist Dreven civilians during a Tessin crisis will be read as taking sides. Then it will be read correctly, send them. She stood in the monitoring room after Meyerth left, palms flat on the console. The feed still showed the neutral zone, where Hale was kneeling beside the Dreven girl, tearing a strip from his own sleeve to bandage the scrape on her elbow. The girl was watching his face the way Lysine, the translator, had watched it in the lower ring's tunnels, the way the Corvin attendant had watched it on the dining hall floor. The look of someone who has been treated as though they matter by a person who gains nothing from it. That night she wrote the first draft of a letter she never sent. 3 sentences. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything I thought I understood about Worth. I think you may be the most dangerous man on this station because you make people better without ever asking them to be. She burned the letter, but the words settled into her bones like reinforcing steel, and every day since, she had felt them bearing weight she had not known she was carrying. In the months that followed, the station changed around Declan Hale in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The Corvin workers in the lower ring began consulting him on maintenance schedules. Lysine's translation team started routing minor interspecies disputes through his office before they reached formal channels, and the disputes resolved faster and cleaner than anything the official arbitration system produced. The Dreven widow Admiral Karath began inviting him to her table in the senior officer's mess not as a guest, but as a companion, the way soldiers sit with soldiers. Even Warlord Tessic, who had not spoken to anyone outside his delegation since the crisis, sent a formal acknowledgement of Hale's intervention through sealed channels. One line. The human spoke true. Coming from a Tessin warlord, it was the equivalent of a commendation. Velara watched all of it. She watched from gallery rails and security feeds, and through the reports Meyerth brought her each evening. She watched a man build something she had never seen built before, not an alliance, not a power base, not a political network, but a web of trust so fine and so strong that it held the station together in ways the official charter could not. And she watched herself, circling the truth like a ship afraid to dock, knowing that every day she did not speak was another day she failed to earn the right to stand near him. 5 months before the Accord renewal, the Caliph made their first serious move against him. Meyerth brought the report at dawn, a formal complaint filed through arbitration channels, alleging that Commander Hale had violated Section 9 of the Lyren Neutrality Compact by providing unauthorized material support to the Dreven delegation during the Tessin crisis. The complaint was technically accurate. Hale had used Station Common medical supplies to treat the Dreven families he had rescued, and under the compact's narrowest reading, Station Common resources deployed for the benefit of a single delegation during an active dispute constituted partisan intervention. The penalty was expulsion, permanent revocation of Earth's observer status, and a 5-cycle ban on human presence aboard Lyren Station. Velara read the complaint 3 times. The legal reasoning was pristine. Lord Rathan had not written it. The Caliph employed specialists for this kind of surgical work, but his fingerprints were on every clause. The complaint was not about medical supplies. It was about a human who had accumulated too much trust on a station where trust was supposed to be denominated in treaties and trade concessions, not in crawling through tunnels and bandaging children's elbows. She sent Meyerth to pull the arbitration panel's docket and then sat alone in her study, looking at the wall, and confronted a question she had been refusing to answer for 2 years. What was she willing to lose? Not for Earth, not for diplomacy, for him. The answer arrived without fanfare. It had been sitting in her chest since the lower ring, packed tight and waiting, and when she finally opened the door, it walked through with the quiet certainty of a man who knew where every pipe joint was. Everything. She was willing to lose everything. She filed House Solen's first formal defense brief in 11 cycles, a legal instrument so rarely deployed that Meyerth had to retrieve the template from deep archive. The brief did not argue technicalities. It argued precedent. Specifically, it cited 14 instances in the last 30 cycles where delegations had deployed Station Common resources during crises without complaint, including 3 by the Caliph themselves. It cited the Lyren Charter's founding preamble, which defined the station's purpose as the preservation of life and the facilitation of cooperation among all species present. It cited a subsection that Hale himself had once pointed out to her during a maintenance office visit, when he had been explaining how the station's original Corvin architects had embedded cooperative principles into the physical infrastructure itself. She cited a human. In a House Solen legal filing, the political implications were a controlled detonation. The arbitration panel deliberated for 9 days. During those 9 days, something happened that Velara had not anticipated. The station's lower ring residents, Corvin workers, Theshan translators, Dreven families, the scattered representatives of 6 minor delegations who had no legal standing in arbitration proceedings began appearing outside the panel's chambers, not protesting, not demonstrating, standing, quietly in rotating shifts around the clock. Lysine organized the schedule. The Corvin logistics specialist provided supply runs. Admiral Karath sent 2 Dreven honor guards to stand at the corridor junction, not as military presence but as witnesses. No one told them to do this. No one organized a campaign or drafted a petition or gave a speech. They simply came, because the man who had fixed their water and pulled their translators from sealed bulkheads and walked into a warlord's corridor alone was being taken from them, and they did not know how to express what that loss would mean except by being present. On the 9th day, the panel dismissed the Caliph complaint. The deciding vote came from a Thessian arbiter who had never shown particular sympathy for Earth's mission. Her written opinion was 2 sentences. The compact exists to protect the station's residents. Commander Hale has done more to protect those residents than any invocation of the compact itself. Velara read the opinion in her study, and something that had been clenched behind her ribs for 9 days released all at once. She pressed her palms flat on her desk and breathed and did not cry, because Solène princesses did not cry, and then she cried anyway silently in her private study, where no one could see. Not from relief, from the accumulated weight of watching a good man defend himself against the machinery she had once been part of. That evening she went to the maintenance office. She did not pretend to review supply logs. She walked in and sat in the battered chair and said, "I filed the defense brief." Hale looked up from his terminal. He had known, of course. The entire station had known House Solène's defense of a human attaché was the loudest political statement the station had heard in a decade. But hearing her say it, watching her sit in his salvaged chair and claim the act without excuse or political framing, did something to his face that she had never seen before. The composure held. It always held, but beneath it, for just a moment, she saw the cost. 3 years of patience was not free. 3 years of being steady while the station sorted him into categories he did not fit was not costless. The man had reserves, deep ones, but they were not infinite, and the Caliph complaint had drawn against them in a way that the toasts and the exclusions and the protocol maneuvering had not. He had been afraid, not of expulsion, of what would happen to the people in the lower ring if he was removed, the Corvin workers who had learned to trust his maintenance schedules. Lissine, whose daughter drew pictures of a man with pointed ears and blue skin, the Dreven families whose children still waved at him in the corridors. "Thank you," he said, 2 words. He had never thanked her before, not once in 3 years. Not for the supply codes, not for the visits, not for the cargo resolution she had adopted from his suggestion. He had accepted those things the way a man accepts rainfall, grateful for the water, unwilling to demand it, aware it could stop at any time. But this was different. This had cost her something visible, something the entire station could measure, and he was acknowledging the price she had paid. "Don't thank me," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "I should have done it a year ago. I should have done it the day you fixed the water in the lower ring. I should have done it when you knelt on that dining hall floor and picked up glass with your bare hands while I sat at the head of the table and did nothing." She stopped. She was saying more than she had planned. The words were escaping the careful architecture of 3 decades of diplomatic training and running free, and she could not catch them. "Velara." His voice was quiet, and it was the first time he had ever used her name. She looked at him. He had not moved from behind his terminal. The green Valeth infusion sat untouched beside his elbow. His gray eyes were steady, but something in them had shifted, not the careful neutrality of a man managing expectations, but the raw, unguarded attention of a man who was hearing something he needed to hear and was terrified of hearing it wrong. "I know what this is," he said. "I've known for a long time, but I need to hear it from you in words, without the politics and without the house and without the uniform." He paused. "Because I have been very careful for 3 years not to want something I was not allowed to have." The air in the maintenance office was suddenly insufficient. The station's ventilation system hummed its usual low note, and outside the door she could hear the Corvin workers changing shifts, and everything was ordinary and nothing was ordinary at all. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She stood up and walked out of the maintenance office without answering, and the shame of that departure was worse than anything that had come before, because this time he had not just asked a question about belonging. He had named what lived between them, and she had failed. 2 days. She carried his words for 2 days, and now the accord renewal was 6 hours away, and the Caliph were trying to erase him again, and Velara was done failing. The circlet sat cold across her brow. Velara turned from the mirror and walked to the conquered hall. The delegations were filing in. The Caliph arrived first, Lord Rathan's silver-white robes catching the light, his expression arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who believed he had already won. The Dreven contingent followed, Admiral Karath walking with the careful dignity of a woman who had buried her grief in duty, and found that duty could hold it. The Corvin, the Theshan observers, the minor delegations from the outer systems all took their places in the tiered gallery. The human delegation seats were at the end of the front row, 3 chairs. Earth's ambassador Chen took the first, her aide took the second. The third remained empty. Velara's chest tightened. She looked at Myrth, who confirmed it. The Caliph filed a secondary motion, emergency session. Your counter-petition was filed under personal seal. They argued it lacks House authority for charter-level disputes. The arbitration panel accepted it 40 minutes ago. Commander Hale has been denied entry to the hall. Velara stood very still. The hall was filling. The ceremony would begin in minutes. Lord Rathan was wearing the small, satisfied expression she had seen him carry at the state dinner, when his toast had made a man invisible and no one at the table had moved. She had 2 choices: accept the ruling and let the ceremony proceed without Hale. The safe option, the expected option, the one that preserved House Solen's alliances and cost her nothing except one more piece of the self-respect she had been hemorrhaging for 3 years. Or she could do what Declan Hale would do. She could walk into the corridor alone and stand where it mattered and let the cost be what it was. 2 days ago in the maintenance office, she had walked away from the truth. She would not walk away again. She stepped down from her dais. The movement was small, but in the conquered hall, where every gesture was calibrated and every position carried centuries of meaning, a princess leaving her elevated seat was an act that silenced conversations from the first row to the highest gallery tier. Myrth made a sound half word, half warning. Velara did not look back. She walked down the center aisle of the hall, her boots striking the obsidian floor with the measured cadence of a woman who had finally stopped calculating. Past the Caliph section, where Rathan's smile froze on his face. Past the Dreven seats, where Admiral Karath's eyes tracked her with sudden sharp attention. Past the minor delegations who turned in their seats. Past Ambassador Chen, who half rose from her chair. She walked to the great doors, and she opened them herself, not signaling for a guard, not waiting for ceremony. She put her hands on the carved handles and pulled them wide, and Declan Hale was standing on the other side. He was in his dress uniform, the dark earth-issue formal wear called service blues, though they were closer to black. His jaw was clean-shaven for the first time she could remember, and without the stubble he looked younger and more exposed, and she could see a thin scar along his left temple that she had never noticed before. His bearing was the same, composed, steady, grounded, but something in his gray eyes shifted when he saw her. Not much. A fraction. The way a man's face changes when something he had stopped hoping for appears in front of him. "Your Grace," he said, the same words, the same measured tone, but she heard what lived underneath them now, 3 years of patient, stubborn, unshakable dignity that had asked nothing and given everything and never once demanded to be seen. She had seen him anyway. "Commander Hale." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not, so she clasped them behind her back in the military posture of House Solen. "The Caliph have filed a motion to exclude you from this ceremony on the grounds of species compatibility protocol. I am here to inform you that House Solen rejects that motion." She paused, and the next words left her mouth before her political instincts could intercept them. Not under personal seal, under full house authority. Behind her, she heard Meyerth's sharp intake of breath. Under full house authority meant the house's entire political weight: alliances, trade agreements, military partnerships, a decade of careful positioning. All of it staked on the right of one human to walk through a door. Hale looked at her. His eyes were gray, and she had spent 3 years learning that gray was not a cold color. It was the color of steel that had been tested and held. The color of morning before the sun committed to rising. The color of patience that had outlasted every cruelty directed at it and come out the other side not bitter but burnished. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "The political cost is mine to pay." She stepped aside and held the door open. "Walk in, Commander." He studied her face for a moment. Whatever he found there settled something behind his eyes, the last bolt finding its seat, the last joint locking into place. He walked through the door, and Velara fell into step beside him, and together they walked the length of the conquered hall while 400 delegates watched in absolute silence. She felt the eyes, Rathan's narrow and calculating, Admiral Karath's bright with something that might have been recognition, the Theshan observers whispering. The Corvan envoys, very still one of them, an older male, set down his datapad and simply watched. Ambassador Chen pressed her hand to her chest. When they reached the front of the hall, Velara did not return to her dais. She did not climb back to the elevated position from which, 3 years ago, she had spoken down to this man. She stood beside the human delegation seats and said, in a voice that carried to the highest tier of the gallery, "House Solen formally moves that Earth's provisional mission be granted aligned status under the Lyren Charter. Commander Declan Hale will speak as Earth's representative at this renewal." The hall erupted, not in violence, in the sharp, pressurized hiss of 400 political actors recalculating their positions simultaneously. Rathan rose from his seat. 3 Caliph delegates began talking at once. Meyerth was making notes on her datapad, with the focused intensity of a woman documenting a controlled detonation. Rathan's voice cut through the noise. "Point of order." He was standing, silver-white robes arranged with the precise carelessness of a man who rehearsed every fold. "The motion is invalid. House Solen cannot invoke full house authority on behalf of a non-aligned species without a unanimous vote of the principal delegations. This is a foundational rule of the Lyren Charter, and the princess knows it." He was right. Velara's jaw tightened. She had known the rule when she invoked full house authority. She had hoped the political momentum would carry past it. But Rathan had not become the Caliph's senior ambassador by letting momentum substitute for law. The arbitration panel's chief clerk, a thin-featured Theshan who had served the station for 30 years, consulted his records and confirmed. "Lord Rathan is correct. Full house authority requires endorsement from at least one additional principal delegation." Velara looked across the hall. The principal delegations were 4: House Solen, the Caliph, the Dreven Empire, and the Tessen Collective. The Caliph would never endorse. The Tessen had sealed their quarter, which left the Dreven and Admiral Karath, who had buried her son 4 months ago and owed the station's politics nothing. Karath met Velara's eyes from the second tier. The Admiral's face carried the look of a woman measuring a distance she had already decided to cross. "House Dreven endorses the motion." Karath's voice was quiet, but it carried the way a cannon carries, not through volume, but through the certainty that what followed would not be taken back. "Commander Hale sat with me for 9 hours after my son's ship was lost at Varek's Reach. He did not offer platitudes. He did not offer political condolences. He asked me my son's name, and he listened while I said it, and that is worth more than every aligned species charter in this sector." The silence that followed was heavier than the silence after Velara's motion. It was the silence of a room reminded that the systems they had built, the charters, the protocols, the carefully maintained hierarchies, existed to serve people, not the other way around. Rathan recovered quickly. Two principal endorsements do not constitute unanimity. The motion still. A low voice from the Tessin delegation's sealed communication channel broke through the hall's speakers. Warlord Tessik's seal preceded it one line, transmitted from the quarter he had not left since the crisis. The human spoke truth to us when no one else came. We will hear him speak it to the hall. The Tessin endorse. 3 of 4 principles. The charter required unanimity for some motions, but aligned status proposals needed only a supermajority. Rathan's own rule had been turned against him. The Caliph delegation went silent not in agreement, but in the cold recognition that the ground had shifted beneath them, and they had no procedural weapon left to fire. One by one, the minor delegations added their voices. The Corvin trade envoys, the older male who had set down his datapad, stood and said, simply, "We've watched him fix things." Theshan observers followed. A Solen military advisor from Velara's own delegation stood without being asked. Not everyone. 2 minor delegations abstained. But enough. Enough for the motion to carry. Enough for Hale to stand at the speaking floor and address the conquered not as an observer, not as a courtesy, but as a recognized voice. He stood where Velara had stood 3 years ago when she had told him he was beneath her. The same obsidian floor, the same tiered gallery above. He spoke for 7 minutes. He did not talk about Earth's strength or humanity's accomplishments or the injustice of their exclusion. He talked about the water reclamation failure in the lower ring, and the 17 families in the Tessin quarter, and Admiral Karath's son, whose name was Varek, and who had been 23 years old when his ship was lost. He talked about the Corvin attendant who had dropped a tray of crystal at a state dinner, and how no one at the table had moved to help her. He talked about Lysine, the Theshan translator whose daughter had been ill during the water crisis, and who had worked 12-hour shifts anyway, because she believed someone was going to make the pipes hold. He talked about worth, not as an abstraction, not as a philosophical position. As pipe sealant and shipping corridors and torn sleeves and bandaged hands, and the name of a child who had taken a stranger's fingers and walked out of a warlord's holding cell. He talked about Lyren Station itself, not as a political construct, not as a charter and a set of protocols, but as a place where people lived and worked and raised children and buried their dead and tried, imperfectly and stubbornly, to build something that held. He talked about what it meant to be unaligned, to exist in a system that acknowledged your presence but not your voice, that allowed you to observe but not to speak, that gave you a seat at the end of the table and no glass to raise when the toast was called. And then, in the last 30 seconds, he said something that cracked the hall open. "I did not come to this station to prove humanity's worth. I came because there were people here who needed things fixed, and I knew how to fix them. I stayed because some of those people became the closest thing to family I have ever had." His voice was steady, but Velara heard the grain in it, the texture of a truth that cost something to say aloud. "I am not asking for aligned status because Earth deserves it. I am asking because the people on this station, all of them, in every ring, in every quarter, deserve to be heard by anyone willing to listen. And I am willing." When he finished, the hall was silent, not the silence of exclusion. This was the silence of recognition. The moment when a room full of people who had built their lives on hierarchy looked at a man who had built his on service and could not find a category to contain him. The Accord renewal was ratified with Earth as an aligned member. The vote carried over Caliph objection. The charter was amended. 3 years of observer status ended with a show of hands, and Declan Hale walked off the speaking floor as a recognized voice in a system that had spent 3 years trying to silence him. The delegations began filing out in the careful choreography of political withdrawal. The Caliph departed first, Rathan's face a mask of calculation, already running forward to the next maneuver. The minor delegations followed in clusters, those who had supported the motion and wanted to be seen near it, and those who had abstained and wanted to be seen nowhere near it. Velara stood at the edge of the speaking floor and watched the hall empty. She had not spoken to Hale since the doors. The ceremony had consumed the space between them, filled it with procedure and speeches and the mechanical business of charter amendments. But the ceremony was ending now, and the space was opening again, and she could feel the weight of 2 days ago pressing against her teeth. Ambassador Chen paused at Velara's side. "Thank you, Your Grace, for what you did today." Velara looked at her. "I didn't do it for Earth, Ambassador." Chen's eyes moved to Hale, who was speaking quietly with the Corvin envoy near the gallery steps, and she nodded. "I know." Admiral Karath was the last delegate to leave. She paused at the doors and looked back, and the expression on her face was the look of a woman who had lost her son and found, in the recognition between two people who had earned each other, a small fierce proof that something in the universe still worked the way it was supposed to. She inclined her head to Velara, to Hale, to whatever lived between them that the whole hall had felt but neither of them had named, and walked out. The doors closed. The conquered hall was empty except for Velara and Hale, and the torchvine blossoms rustling in the ventilation current. The banners of silver and deep indigo swayed overhead. The obsidian floor held their reflections like dark water. Hale turned from the gallery steps and walked toward her. His dress uniform was creased from 7 minutes of standing under the attention of 400 people, and the scar on his temple caught the overhead light, and his gray eyes were the same gray eyes that had looked at her 3 years ago when she had told him he was beneath her and he had said, "Understood, Your Grace," and meant it. He stopped 3 paces from her. The distance of protocol. The distance of a man who had been trained by 3 years of exclusion to measure the space he was allowed to occupy. Velara. He said her name the way he had said it in the maintenance office 2 days ago carefully, as if testing whether the permission still held. "You used my name in front of the whole hall," she said. "You told me to stop calling you Your Grace." "I didn't tell you, I asked. There's a difference." She paused. "I have spent 3 years learning that difference from you, and I have been a very slow student." He was quiet for a moment. The empty hall was vast around them, the tiered galleries rising into shadow, the obsidian floor stretching to the great doors. It was the same hall where she had spoken down to him, and the same hall where she had walked beside him, and now it was theirs alone, and the silence was not the brittle kind or the companionable kind. It was the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of a conversation that would change everything, and knowing that the first word would be a door that could not be closed. "2 days ago," she said, "in the maintenance office, you said you had been careful not to want something you were not allowed to have." "I did. And I walked out because I was afraid." She held his gaze. The amber of her eyes burned, and she did not care. "I am still afraid. I am afraid of what my house will say. I am afraid of what the Caliph will do. I am afraid that everything I was taught about rank and distance and the proper ordering of the galaxy is so deep in my bones that I will hurt you again without meaning to." "You will," he said, and the honesty of it hit her like a pressure change. "And I'll tell you when you do. And you'll tell me when I'm being too careful with you, when I'm holding back because I've spent 3 years calibrating the exact amount of space you need." She almost smiled, almost. "You have been holding back." "I have been holding back," he confirmed, "since the night at the viewport after the state dinner, when you told me the toast was poorly done, and I wanted to tell you that the only person at that table I wanted a glass from was you." The words dissolved something in her chest that had been calcified for years, not the blade that had been dissolving since the lower ring. This was the armor she had built around the blade, the careful shell of rank and training, and the phrase, "You are beneath me, human," that she had used to protect herself from the specific vulnerability of caring about someone who would not play the game the way she had been taught to play it. "Declan," she stepped forward, closing one of the 3 paces. 2 remained. "I owe you an apology, not for today, for the first day, for the words I spoke in this hall when you arrived. I told you that you were beneath me." She paused. The hall was so quiet she could hear the torchvine blossoms rustling in the ventilation current. I was wrong. I have been wrong every day since. And I have spent 3 years watching you treat every person on this station with more dignity than I treated you on the day we met. She closed the second pace. One remained. I think you may be the finest man I have ever known, she said, and I have spent 3 years being too proud to say so, and that pride has cost me the thing I value most. What thing? He asked, and his voice was careful, the voice of a man who had learned not to hope for too much because the hoping hurt worse than the absence. You, she said, not his respect, not his companionship, not a diplomatic formulation wrapped in political language, him. I value you. I have valued you since you crawled through tunnels to fix water pipes for people my house could not be bothered to notice. I have valued you since you knelt on a dining hall floor and bled for a Corvin girl who dropped a tray. I have valued you since you walked into a warlord's corridor alone and talked a man out of killing 17 people by saying something I still don't know the words to. She paused, and her voice cracked, and she did not care. And I am asking, not commanding, not ordering, not invoking house authority. I am asking if you will let me stand beside you, not above you, not ahead of you, beside. Hale looked at her. The composure was still there. It would always be there, because it was not a mask but a foundation, but beneath it she saw the thing he had carried for 3 years without once setting it down. He had not flinched on the first day, and the reason was not indifference. The reason was that he had looked at a proud, dismissive alien princess and seen something worth being steady for. He closed the last pace himself. You weren't wrong about everything, he said quietly. I am beneath you, in rank, in title, in every measurement your people use. The faintest ghost of that almost smile crossed his face, the one she had first seen at the viewport, the one that was not a politician's curve but something real and earned. But I have been standing beside you for 3 years, Velara. You just weren't looking down. Her eyes burned. She blinked, and her vision blurred amber fire viewed through salt water, and she did not care that the conquered hall's security feeds were recording this. And she did not care that Myrth would have opinions she was professionally obligated to keep. And she did not care about anything except the man in front of her who had spent 3 years being worth more than her composure could contain. She reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had held pipe sealant and supply manifests and broken crystal and a frightened child's fingers. It was warm. It was calloused. It was the steadiest thing she had ever held. I need you to know something, she said. The letter I wrote after the Tessin corridor, the one I burned. It said you were the most dangerous man on the station, because you make people better without asking them to be. His hand tightened around hers. You didn't need me to make you better. You just needed someone to be worth the trouble of changing your mind. She almost laughed. It came out as something between a breath and a sound, rough and unpolished, and entirely unlike the measured voice of a Solène princess. You are worth considerably more trouble than I have caused you, and I intend to spend a very long time making up the difference. He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved against her knuckles, a small, deliberate motion, the way he did everything, as if each gesture had been considered and found necessary. I'll hold you to that, he said. Velara stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, and his arm came around her shoulders slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything, and settled there with the solid certainty of a man who had finally been recognized by the one person whose recognition he had quietly, impossibly, patiently waited for. The observation deck was 30 meters down the corridor, but they did not walk there. They stood in the empty conquered hall, on the obsidian floor where she had once spoken down to him, and where he had later spoken up for an entire station, and the torchvine blossoms swayed overhead, and the silence between them was neither brittle nor companionable. It was the silence of two people who had said the necessary things, and found that the saying had not diminished them. It had completed them. Outside, through the hall's high windows, the nebula wrapped Lyren station in violet and gold. Somewhere on the station, Lissine the translator was putting her daughter to bed, and the pipes in the lower ring were holding. Somewhere, Admiral Karath was looking at a portrait of a son named Varek. Somewhere, the Corvin attendant who had dropped a tray of crystal was finishing her shift, and the shattered glass had been swept away long ago, but the memory of a man who had knelt to help her remained. And here in the empty conquered hall, a princess who had once said, "You are beneath me," human stood with her forehead against a human's chest and learned the last lesson he had to teach her. Worth is not measured in rank. It is not measured in titles or bloodlines or the height of the dais you stand on. It is measured in what you do when no one important is watching, in the hours you spend in tunnels no one asked you to enter, in the corridors you walk alone, in the hands you hold when the holding costs you everything and gains you nothing. Declan Hale had measured out his worth in 3 years of silence and service and stubborn, unshakable dignity. Velara pressed her hand against his chest, over the steady beat of a heart that had never once faltered, and said the words she should have said on the first day in the hall, when a human had inclined his head 1 degree and said, "Understood, Your Grace," and meant it. "Welcome home, Commander." His arm tightened around her, solid, certain, the weight of a man who had finally been given the one thing he had never allowed himself to ask for. "Welcome home, Velara," he said. And for the first time in 3 years, the blade in her sternum dissolved. In its place was something warm and steady and permanent, the knowledge that she had not been diminished by standing beside him. She had been completed by it. And Declan Hale, who had never asked to be seen, held the woman who had finally seen him, and the empty hall held them both. And outside the nebula turned its ancient light across a station where the pipes were holding, and the people were safe, and a human had been recognized at last.